It was a night like any other at Ashgrove Hall, the kind where whispers linger in every corner, and shadows seem to hold secrets of their own. But that night the silence was louder than any conversation. The heirloom silver spoon, once a symbol of wealth and legacy, had been quietly tucked away, until it was found, its tarnished surface holding a truth far darker than anyone could imagine. A truth that had been buried for decades. What if a single object, a simple piece of silver, could unravel a family's deepest, deadliest secrets? And what if you were the one who discovered it? The question isn't just who did it. It's, are you ready to hear the truth that could shatter everything you thought you knew? It was a morning draped in uneasy calm in the quiet village of Santa Laura, the kind of morning that whispered instead of spoke, where the mist clung to the hedgerows like a secret unwilling to lift. Within the ivy-wrapped frame of a centuries-old cottage, Miss Eliza Marwood sat as she always did, in a time-worn armchair beside the hearth, her knitting needles clinking softly like faint echoes of time gone by. Her expression was serene, but her mind was always awake, always listening, always stitching more than just wool. She stitched patterns of truth from the unraveling threads of human nature. When the post arrived with its usual thump against the oak door, she did not look up immediately. The daily letters were rarely more than dull circulars or vague pleasantries from distant acquaintances. But today's delivery bore a breath of something other, a heavy cream envelope edged in gold, sealed with an unfamiliar yet strangely noble crest that made her hand pause mid-stitch. When she turned it over and read the name, Lady Imogen Blackwell, a ghost passed through her mind. That name had not crossed her path in nearly 3 decades, not since the night of the infamous midwinter ball, where laughter turned to screams and a family secret had vanished into silence. The letter inside was both elegant and urgent, inviting her to Blackwell Manor under the guise of a silver heirloom auction. Yet Eliza could feel it in the ink, desperation masquerading as decorum. "It is our hope," it read, "that you may find the event enlightening." Enlightening. No one used that word lightly. She tucked the letter into her coat and knew, not decided, that she would go. In the hours that followed, the village whispered to her in fragments. At the apothecary, the moment she mentioned the manor, the air grew still. The pharmacist's hand trembled over a bottle of valerian as he muttered, "The silver, it's never brought anything but sorrow." At the bakery, the boy behind the counter paled and pretended not to hear her. The words "cursed spoon" passed through a nearby customer's lips like a prayer one shouldn't utter. Everywhere she went, eyes turned away, voices lowered, and doors seemed to close just a touch faster than usual. And so, when she arrived at Blackwell Manor the next morning, it was not curiosity that guided her steps, but the weight of a puzzle long dormant. The estate stood like a relic of pride corrupted, stone archways cracked, windows dimmed by time, and ivy that wrapped the building like chains rather than decoration. Lady Imogen greeted her with practiced grace, but it cracked around the edges. Her smile was stretched too tight, her voice too smooth, her eyes flickering as though rehearsing what not to say. The household stood assembled like suspects in a play. Lord Thomas Blackwell, rigid and hollow-eyed. His sister Evelyn, all fluttering pearls and trembling hands, a distant cousin Julian, who leaned against the wall with the apathy of youth, but eyes that missed nothing, and a maid with eyes red from weeping who would not meet Eliza's gaze. Even the butler, old, thin, almost ghostly, carried the tray as though it bore secrets heavier than silver. The drawing room, where the auction was to take place, was less a gallery than a stage set for revelation. Silver pieces gleamed beneath dim light, goblets, chalices, trays. But it was the spoon that gripped Eliza's attention, smaller than she expected, almost plain, and yet its presence pulsed in the glass case like a beating heart. The butler lingered near it too long as he cleaned the display, whispering more to himself than anyone else. That things brought nothing but grief should have been buried with her. Eliza did not ask who her was, not yet. She merely offered a gentle smile, and catalogued every strained expression, every nervous glance, every too careful silence. She had learned long ago, the louder someone laughs, the more they are hiding, and in this house, no one was laughing. The walls were holding their breath, and so was she. For in that unremarkable spoon, Eliza Marwood felt the weight of a story struggling to resurface, a story that someone in that house would do anything to keep buried. The evening at Wexley Grange began under a sky, the color of bruised ink, where even the moon seemed reluctant to look down. And the gravel path leading to the grand oak doors crackled like bones beneath carriage wheels. Inside, firelight danced along the gilded frames of faded portraits, casting long twitching shadows that seemed to whisper secrets in the corners. The scent of beeswax and old stone hung in the air like an unfinished sentence, and every tick of the grandfather clock in the drawing room sounded more like a countdown than the passage of time. The Blackbridge family, brittle with pride and worn by generations of scandal, hosted the evening's exhibition as both a tribute to legacy and a plea for reputation. But there was a tension so tightly coiled within the walls that even the candles flickered as if uneasy. Miss Helena Grey, known in hushed tones as the woman who uncovered the Grendel disappearance and the Ravensby mirror case, arrived quietly, unnoticed by most, save the housemaid who crossed herself when their eyes met. Among the velvet-draped displays were ornate rings, ancient lockets, a ceremonial dagger, with dried rust too dark for iron, and in the very center, the infamous Blackbridge pendant, an emerald circled with black onyx, last seen on Lysandra Blackbridge the night she walked into the woods and never returned. It was said the pendant was cursed, that any who wore it vanished or went mad, but the family kept it on display, like a trophy wrestled from death itself. Or they had. Now, as the guests sipped sherry and strained to smile through the awkward formality, a thin cry rose from the center of the room. The glass dome housing the pendant stood wide open, its contents missing. The velvet beneath bore no impression, no dust, only a strange crescent-shaped mark like a burn. Panic didn't burst, it crept, thick as fog. Lady Celeste dropped her glass. Lord Edwin gripped the mantle as if bracing for impact, and the youngest heir, Ellis, whispered something under his breath, something in a tongue Helena recognized but hadn't heard in years. She moved silently through the crowd, her eyes noting every flinch, every sudden silence. A servant at the rear door swore he'd seen Lysandra standing at the threshold, her gown dripping wet, eyes hollow, but when he opened the door, only wind rushed in and the chandelier above groaned ominously. Lady Celeste began to tremble, her fingers brushing the spot on her neck where the pendant once lay, a phantom weight pulling at her skin. Then, as if some unseen string had snapped, she collapsed, her body folding like paper, a soundless gasp leaving her lips. The guests recoiled, some rushing to help, others backing away, as if expecting the floor to open. Helena remained still, watching. There was something wrong with the room itself now. The temperature had dropped and the walls felt closer. As the doctor fumbled with smelling salts, and the butler tried to steady his trembling hands, Helena approached the now vacant display. On the inner edge of the velvet lining was a single strand of hair, white, impossibly long and wet. Behind her, a portrait shifted on its hinge with a hollow thud, revealing not a passage, but a crack in the plaster, fresh, as though the house itself was trying to shed its secrets. The maid began to sob quietly, saying over and over, "She's come back, she never left." And in the fireplace, among the dying embers, Helena spotted something gleaming, a fragment of the pendant's chain, twisted and half melted, as if someone had tried to destroy it, or something had resisted being destroyed. She knew then this wasn't about inheritance, or greed, or even vengeance. This was about silence, generational silence so deep it had grown teeth. The pendant had not been stolen, it had been reclaimed. By whom, or what, Helena could not yet say, but the house was no longer still. It was watching, breathing, remembering, and whatever had awakened tonight was far from finished. It was the smallest of things that would have escaped the notice of most, perhaps a careless fingerprint, an overlooked smudge of dust on the polished silver tray, or the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the ancient oak floorboards underfoot. These inconspicuous signs, usually dismissed, had a way of drawing Miss Helen Ashford's attention. She had learned long ago that small things, when placed together, often told the most significant stories, and in her experience, small details had a tendency to unravel larger, far darker truths. The faintest smudge on the surface of the silver plate, half hidden behind a forgotten portrait, was the first thing she noticed. A careless thing, yes, but it bothered her, stayed with her in the hours that followed. She tucked the observation away, silently, as if writing it down in the invisible ledger of her mind. For, as she well knew, silver spoons did not vanish without reason, and whoever had taken it had left behind something far more telling than they realized, an unspoken confession, a clue too small to be noticed, yet too glaring to ignore. The tension in the room thickened, but it was the absence of one individual that truly unsettled Miss Ashford, the maid who had been expected to arrive that afternoon. Her presence had been quietly arranged, her arrival meticulously planned. She was to bring with her the missing documents, the very provenance that would finally settle the mystery of the silver spoon. But she never came. No telegram, no word, just the void of her disappearance, as though she had melted into thin air. Miss Ashford's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what little information she had. The maid, who had been living in a small lodging in the village, had vanished without a trace the night before her journey. No explanation, no sign of a struggle, she simply disappeared. The housekeeper, who had been the one to deliver the news, betrayed no emotion, her face a mask of neutrality. But Miss Ashford, with her sharp eye for detail, noticed the trembling hands that gripped the edge of her apron. It was a subtle gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Miss Ashford knew something was terribly amiss. This was no simple case of nerves or change of heart. There was far more to this disappearance than anyone was willing to admit. It was not the first time someone connected to the cursed Ashford manor had vanished under mysterious circumstances. No, this was something else entirely. The silence that accompanied the maid's absence was heavy, as if it had been carefully crafted by those who feared the truth would one day surface. It was the kind of silence that only existed when too many people had agreed to remain quiet, to withhold information. A shared, unspoken pact to avoid the truth. Determined to unravel the threads, Miss Ashford spent the afternoon quietly making her rounds. A knitting bag in hand, a polite smile fixed in place, she sought out those who might hold a piece of the puzzle. First, she spoke with the butcher's wife, who recalled the maid as a quiet, pleasant girl, with a soft smile, and an unfortunate tendency to fall for the wrong sort of men. Then, she visited old Mrs. Delaney, who had worked alongside the maid in the kitchens. Miss Delaney, though, defended the girl, swearing that she was no thief, despite the rumors that had circulated around the village. In a place like Ashford, where memories had a way of lingering longer than any guessed, the stories only grew more convoluted. The maid had left Ashford Manor abruptly, it seemed, after a terrible misunderstanding involving missing silver and a whispered accusation of theft. But no one could remember who had made the accusation or why. Some said the girl had disappeared before she could defend herself, leaving behind a cloud of uncertainty. Miss Ashford listened, her patience never wavering, as she sifted through the half-truths and gossip. Piece by piece, the jigsaw began to take shape, and a darker story began to emerge. The maid's disappearance was not as simple as everyone wanted to believe. There was more beneath the surface, something twisted and buried in the shadows. But it was in the village churchyard, as the evening sun cast long shadows over the gravestones, that the conversation finally shifted into dangerous territory. Two elderly sisters, speaking in hushed tones, began to share their version of the story. "Pretty little thing," one of them murmured, her voice laced with scandal, but far too friendly with "well, you know." The other sister gave a pointed cough, as if to silence her, but Miss Ashford knew that silence spoke volumes. She waited, allowing the pause to stretch, and soon the full story began to emerge. There had been a secret romance, hurried and hushed, between the maid and one of the Harrow family. The Harrows, after all, were local aristocrats, powerful, influential. "A foolish girl," one sister skecked, shaking her head, "should have known her place." But Miss Ashford knew better. She had seen this before too many times to count. Scandals were rarely the fault of one person alone. They were tangled webs, complicated and dangerous, woven from the actions of many. The consequences often fell unevenly, with the weight of guilt shifted onto those least able to defend themselves. The girl, knave as she had been, had become entangled in a mess far beyond her control. When the affair inevitably ended, violently, as such things often did, the maid had disappeared without a trace, and with her disappearance, she had taken with her the beginnings of a secret too heavy to ever be fully hidden. That evening, as Miss Ashford retired to her room, a strange sound caught her attention, a faint rustling beneath her door. She opened it cautiously to find a single unmarked envelope lying on the floor. No name, no stamp, just an ordinary piece of paper. She picked it up, unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was rushed, almost childish, and the ink smeared in places as if the writer had been in a hurry. The message inside was brief, but its meaning was clear. "Leave Ashford Manor while you still can." The words were simple, but the tone was unmistakable. Miss Ashford placed the letter beside her teacup, her expression calm, betraying nothing. But there was something about the letter, something in the scent that clung to the paper. It was the unmistakable smell of wax polish, thick and overpowering, the very same scent that had clung to the display cases earlier that day. The connection was immediate, and Miss Ashford's pulse quickened. The letter, it seemed, was a warning, delivered in a way that left no room for doubt. A clever threat, calculated and deliberate, designed to unsettle her without leaving a single trace of its origin. The kind of message that, when delivered with such care, could only come from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Ashford sat back, considering the letter with quiet focus. It didn't unsettle her, not in the way it was intended to. No, it clarified her thoughts, sharpened them. The maid's disappearance was not random. It was part of something larger, something far more sinister. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, slowly but surely, and Miss Ashford knew that the truth, though hidden in layers of deception and silence, was within her grasp. It was only a matter of time before the entire story came to light. But Miss Ashford was well aware that the cost of uncovering that truth would be far greater than anyone could anticipate. The faint hum of the clock in the corner of the drawing room was the only sound that disturbed the heavy silence that had settled over the gathering. Lady Helena's fingers rested carefully on the silver teacup in front of her, her gaze steady, but her mind far away, lost in the ever-increasing web of secrets. It had always been like this in Ashford Manor, a family whose history was written in whispers, whose tragedies were buried beneath layers of polished words and perfumed air. The grand ball, the one where the young woman had met her tragic end, was a night that had been talked about for years, each retelling more carefully edited than the last. But in that retelling, Lady Helena had let slip something small, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. The name of the victim, Evelyn Harrow, was spoken without the usual veil of sorrow, the usual formality. Lady Helena's voice faltered, just a moment, as she mentioned Evelyn's last moments. A simple fall from the grand staircase, she had said. A tragic accident. But Miss Eleanor Westbrook, a quiet observer with a sharp eye for detail, had known better. The story that Lady Helena spun was, as always, rehearsed to perfection, but in its delivery, Eleanor sensed something far darker lurking beneath the polished surface. The spoon, the silver spoon that had been part of the evening's entertainment, was more than just an innocent trinket. It was a key, an accidental witness to a secret so dangerous that the very mention of it could drive people to madness. For it wasn't the spoon that was cursed, Eleanor realized, but the knowledge it held. Evelyn had known something, seen something she was never meant to see, and that knowledge had been enough to seal her fate. The real danger had never been the fall, but the truth that had driven her to it. The tension in the room grew tighter with every word Eleanor uttered. The silence, broken only by the rustling of her knitting, was laden with an unspoken understanding. Eleanor knew far more than anyone was willing to admit. The servants, those who had been there that night, spoke in hushed tones. Miss Eleanor had questioned them all, the butler, the maid, even the housekeeper. And one by one, their stories began to unravel. The tragic engagement, the broken betrothal between Evelyn and a Harrow son, rumors swirled about which son it had been. Some swore it was the eldest, the very man who had been seen arguing with Evelyn moments before her fall. Others insisted it was the younger son, whose absence from the ball that night had raised eyebrows. But Eleanor, as always, had listened quietly, her mind working far faster than her hands, knitting calmly as she pieced together the puzzle. She had heard the whispers of a third man, someone whose identity had been shrouded in mystery, a man whom Evelyn had loved, a man whose betrayal had led to her tragic end. It was the servants who spoke of the final moments of Evelyn's life with the most conviction, though their words came with a mixture of fear and reverence. The girl had clutched the silver spoon in her final moments, not just as a symbol of the evening's theme, but as a message. The faintest scratch on its surface, they said, was visible only under the right light, but it was unmistakable. A name, or perhaps an initial hastily carved with trembling fingers. A last attempt to expose the killer, to tell the truth before she was silenced forever. But the spoon had disappeared. Vanished from the scene, only to reappear later, polished and perfect, without a trace of the dying woman's final message. Miss Eleanor listened to the tale with growing disbelief. Yet, in the dark corners of Ashford Manor, where the shadows clung tightly to the walls, she knew the truth. In houses like this, where families had buried secrets for generations, stories like these were not as impossible as they seemed. The inconsistencies piled up: the timing of the fall, the details of Evelyn's engagement, the shifting accounts of who had found her. And when Miss Eleanor pressed further on the subject of the silver spoon's markings, the silence was immediate and deafening. Not one of the family spoke of it, as though the very mention of the spoon's message could conjure something too dangerous to acknowledge. This was the silence of a family bound by their own collective lie, a silence that Miss Eleanor recognized from the many cases she had solved over the years. It was the silence of those who knew the truth, but had made an unspoken pact to forget it. As she continued her inquiries, Eleanor became acutely aware of the presence that lingered in the background, someone watching her, following her every move with quiet attention. It was a presence that never stayed too long, never lingered too obviously, but always remained close enough that Eleanor could feel the weight of it on her shoulders. It was as if someone within the family had understood her purpose from the very start. Whoever they were careful, calculating, and they knew that Eleanor Westbrook was a woman who would not stop until the truth had been exposed. The closer she got, the more the shadows seemed to grow, curling around the edges of Ashford Manor like a living thing, wrapping themselves around the family's carefully constructed lies. And though the walls remained silent, Eleanor was certain that the house was speaking to her in its own way. The secrets were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, whether the family was ready for it or not. The early morning silence of Ashgrove Hall was shattered, not by the usual hum of servants preparing for the day, but by the haunting sound of a single blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house, freezing everyone in their tracks. Colonel Harrow, once a pillar of strength in the family, was found in the library, slumped in his chair, his body contorted in an unnatural position, as though the life had been violently wrenched from him in his final moments. In his hand he clutched a silver fork, its gleaming tines sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the warm, vibrant man he had been just hours before. There was no visible sign of struggle, no blood staining the polished floor beneath him, only the unnerving stillness that comes when a soul is caught between the shock of death and the revelation of something far darker. The servants' murmurs of disbelief filled the air, the housekeeper crossing herself in reflex, while Lady Sylvia stood in the doorway, swaying as though her legs could no longer hold her up. It was not the sight of the body that seized Miss Marple's attention, but the fork, an object chosen with deliberate intent. There was something unsettlingly symbolic about it, something that tied it to the tragic history of the family's past, yet no one dared to question it aloud. As whispers of suspicion spread throughout the house, the air grew thick with the scent of fear. The younger Harrow brother, whose face seemed to have been marked by the bitterness of a long-standing feud, immediately became the focal point of blame. His words dripped with resentment, a sense of entitlement that had long simmered beneath the surface, and yet, Miss Marple knew better. The obvious suspects were rarely the true culprits, and as the family erupted into chaos, her gaze fell upon the smallest of details, a faint smear of wax polish, disturbed by a tiny, almost imperceptible footprint that didn't match the heavy boots of the younger brother. It was a clue, delicate yet revealing, but one that would have to wait until the right moment. As the family argued among themselves, Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She circled the room, noticing yet another clue, a sliver of fine cloth caught on the edge of a side table, too delicate to belong to any of the men in the room. It was a whisper of something far more sinister, something deeper than anyone was willing to admit. She tucked it away carefully, her expression unreadable, knowing full well that the truth lay not in the obvious answers, but in the carefully hidden fragments that would lead her to the heart of the mystery. The silver fork, the vanished spoon, the missing pieces of a puzzle, each one a thread in a tapestry of betrayal, and secrets that had long festered beneath the surface of Ashgrove Hall. The morning after Colonel Harrow's sudden death, Ashgrove Hall seemed unnervingly calm, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Miss Marple sat quietly at the breakfast table, her knitting untouched, her tea cooling beside her. The air around her hummed with the soft clinks of porcelain, yet it was the silence of the others that spoke loudest. Lady Sylvia's fingers trembled as her teacup rattled, the faintest hint of anxiety dancing on her face despite her carefully poised expression. Across from her, Mr. Giles kept his hands buried deep in his pockets, the cufflinks on his sleeves hurriedly fastened, as though in his haste, he had failed to maintain the polished appearance he so often prided himself on. The younger nephew, avoiding eye contact entirely, stared out the window, his fingers tapping a nervous erratic rhythm on the armrest, a pattern that was far too rapid for his usually composed nature. Even the butler, typically the picture of professionalism, stood rigidly at the corner of the room, his eyes darting toward the library door every time someone mentioned the colonel's name. These small gestures, these barely noticeable shifts, were all Miss Marple needed. She had long believed that truth was not found in what people said, but in what they didn't. A trembling hand, averted gaze, a fidgeting finger, these were the subtle betrayals that held the real answers, far more telling than any scripted alibi. As the police began their questioning, the family's responses were smooth and practiced, too smooth, too rehearsed, like a play performed flawlessly but devoid of any real emotion. Lady Sylvia claimed to have retired early, after taking her sleeping draught, an unconvincing tale, as she had made sure to mention it to two separate housemaids. Giles too had an alibi, offering a story about drafting a letter to his solicitor, a letter conveniently left on his desk, undated but ready to produce if needed. Miss Marple listened with polite detachment, but in the quiet of her mind, she saw the gaps, the smoothness of their lies that only sharpened her suspicion. It wasn't proof of guilt yet, but it was a crack in the facade, and Miss Marple knew that where there was a crack, there was always more to discover. Later, with her usual gentle persistence, Miss Marple probed further, her questions so subtle that they seemed innocent, but they caused the cracks to widen. The housekeeper, a woman who carried too many secrets beneath her starched uniform, spoke of her movements with remarkable precision, preparing linens, helping Lady Sylvia's maid, and retiring to her own quarters shortly after 11. Yet, when questioned further, the maid swore that the housekeeper had never come near her that night. The butler, too, seemed to have a different story. He had seen her near the library well past midnight, a time she had conveniently omitted from her own version. Miss Marple said nothing but tucked the inconsistencies away, adding another thread to the unraveling tapestry. But it was the offhand comment from an older servant that would unlock the next door in this web of secrets. "It's always the silver," the servant remarked, polishing the family's tarnished cutlery. "Ever since that girl ran off." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, her interest piqued by the mention of a girl from years ago, a maid who had disappeared in the dead of night, leaving Ashgrove Hall without a word. She had been young and pretty, tangled in a forbidden romance with one of the young masters, a romance that ended in whispered arguments and broken promises. Miss Marple's mind turned the words over, reflecting on how the silver spoon, so long a symbol of the family's power and wealth, had survived when others had not. It was not cursed, she realized. It was merely a witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within these walls. As the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple awoke from a restless sleep, not from sound but from an inexplicable pull toward the mysteries that still clung to the house like dust. The night felt pregnant with unspoken truths, and she knew that every detail, every half-forgotten story, was just a piece in the puzzle waiting to be solved. The silver spoon was not the heart of the mystery, it was merely the beginning, and Miss Marple knew the answers would lie in the stories no one had ever dared to tell. The quiet of the night was thick with secrets, and Miss Marple could almost feel the weight of them pressing against the walls of her small, dimly lit room. The faintest creak of the floorboards echoed, as her sharp gaze fell upon the object resting calmly on her bedside table. It was not merely the presence of the silver spoon that caught her attention, but the deliberate way it had been placed there. Its positioning was too precise, too intentional for it to be a simple oversight. There was no carelessness in its placement, no frantic reach for something hastily abandoned. No, this was a message, a silent, chilling message left for her eyes alone. Her fingers hovered above it, almost as if waiting for it to reveal its truth. She felt a strange shiver as the cold silver met her skin, its surface faintly smudged, as though someone's trembling fingers had recently handled it. It was not merely an object, but a vessel of memory, a token of something far darker than she cared to imagine. With careful deliberation, Miss Marple lifted the spoon, its weight heavier than she had expected, as if it carried the burdens of years gone by. She turned it over in her hands, noting the deep scratchings in its gleaming surface. There, carved with unerring precision, was a date, an unmistakable date, etched into the silver like a scar. It wasn't just any date though, it was the night of the infamous silver-themed ball, a night that had been long buried in the past, whispered about but never spoken of in the light of day. Beneath the date, another detail caught her eye, a set of initials, hastily scrawled yet undeniably legible. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she recognized them, the initials of the missing maid, the young woman who had vanished from Ashgrove Hall years ago under mysterious circumstances, never to be seen again. The maid's disappearance had been a subject of hushed conversations in the village, a shadow that loomed over the house and its inhabitants, but it was only now that the full weight of her absence was coming into sharp focus. Miss Marple's thumb traced the initials, feeling the grooves left by the trembling hand that had etched them into the spoon. It was as if the silver itself had borne witness to the tragedy, and had now become an unwilling messenger, bringing the past crashing back into the present. The once innocent object, now imbued with the weight of guilt, fear and silence, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were alive with memories that demanded to be heard. The spoon was not simply an object from the past, it was a relic of a forgotten love affair, a broken promise, and the hushed guilt of those who had allowed the tragedy to unfold. Miss Marple knew this was not just a coincidence. This was the work of someone who had carefully placed the spoon where it could be found, knowing exactly what it would mean to her. It was a message, a plea for help, perhaps, or a confession too long buried beneath layers of fear. By morning the news had spread through Ashgrove Hall like wildfire. The spoon had been found, they said, as though it had returned of its own volition, like a ghostly calling card that had resurfaced from the depths of the house's long-silenced past. The rumors flew fast, each more exaggerated than the last, but one thing was certain, the house was alive with the whisper of the curse that had haunted its halls for so many years. The housekeeper's hands trembled as she poured the morning tea, her face pale with something more than simple fatigue. She muttered a prayer under her breath, as if seeking protection from something far darker than mere superstition. Lady Sylvia, ever the picture of composed elegance, sat motionless in her chair, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, her lips curling into a tight, forced smile. The color had drained from her face, and despite her effort to remain composed, there was a palpable unease about her. Even the younger nephew, normally the embodiment of calm, could not hide the flickers of fear in his eyes. His gaze darted repeatedly toward the library door, his body stiff with the anticipation of something he dared not confront. Miss Marple, however, was unshaken by their growing panic. Where others saw superstitions and whispered rumors, she saw only the facts. The spoon had not wandered into her room of its own accord. Someone had placed it there with great care, someone who knew exactly what it represented, someone who was sending her a message. Was it a warning, a gesture of guilt from a conscience too burdened to bear its weight any longer? Or perhaps it was a cry for help, from someone trapped in a web of fear and unable to speak the truth aloud. Whoever had left it there had done so with purpose, and Miss Marple was certain they knew she would understand its significance. This was not an object of chance, it was an object of intent, of calculation, and of quiet desperation. Later that morning, as she sat in the corner of the drawing room, Miss Marple turned the spoon over in her hands once more. The date, the initials, the night everything began, all of it led back to this one piece of silver. Its surface, now engraved with guilt, fear and long-held secrets, had borne witness to events that had never been fully understood, much less acknowledged. The maid's disappearance, the shattered love affair, the broken promises, all of it had become tangled in the twisted story of Ashgrove Hall. Miss Marple realized, with a sudden clarity, that the past had never truly been buried. It had only been waiting, dormant and patient, until it could emerge in its own time, demanding justice, demanding truth. And now, with the spoon's return, the house would never be the same again. The air in Ashgrove Hall was thick with the past, with secrets that refused to stay hidden, and Miss Marple knew that the price of those secrets would soon be paid in full. The atmosphere in the drawing room thickened like fog rolling in from a graveyard, cold and stifling, as though the very walls of the manor strained to suppress the truth. The housekeeper, a woman worn thin by years of silence and secrets, stood stiffly by the hearth, her voice cracking not from age, but from the weight of a truth she had buried deep beneath layers of loyalty and fear. "I should have spoken years ago," she breathed, each word dragging behind it the ache of regret. But words are dangerous in a house like this. They don't just echo, they haunt. What followed wasn't a simple confession, but the slow, painful exorcism of a memory long caged in her heart. She spoke of a silver brooch, deceptively small, but as loaded with meaning as a loaded gun. It hadn't just been an accessory, it had been a vessel of truth. On the night of the winter masquerade, a young woman, a guest whose name had been deliberately scrubbed from every record and recollection, had staggered into the side corridor, blood staining her gown, clutching the brooch like a lifeline. With her last ounce of strength, or perhaps just a fractured fingernail, she had etched something onto its back. A symbol, a name, a pair of trembling initials, not enough to tell a full story, but just enough to ignite suspicion in the right hands. The housekeeper had found her, barely alive, the brooch still clenched in her cold fingers. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she did what she had always been trained to do in that house, she cleaned up. The woman died before dawn, and the brooch, or what looked like the brooch, was pinned to the display in the drawing room, harmless, polished, pure. But the real one, the marked one, had vanished. The housekeeper hadn't planned it. She hadn't stolen it. But she had hidden it at first in a drawer, then beneath a loose stone in the garden shed, then somewhere even she dared not admit aloud. And then came the disappearance. The chambermaid, a girl with clever eyes and a foolish heart, vanished the same night, as though the truth had called her away or swallowed her whole. The official story was a runaway, but no one leaves their combs and shoes behind when they run. The housekeeper's voice quivered. She didn't run, she knew. She understood what that brooch meant, who it implicated. And she paid the price for knowing. Miss Marple listened, her hands motionless, her eyes cold and still as a pond just before it breaks into ice. Her silence was sharper than a scream. A sound shifted outside the room, the soft sigh of a floorboard, the hush of retreating footsteps. Someone had been listening. Miss Marple rose without a word, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders like armor, and stepped out into the corridor. The shadows offered no names, but the tension in the air clung like perfume after its wearer has fled. Whoever had overheard now knew Miss Marple held the thread that could unravel everything. And then came a knock, light but reluctant, as if the hand behind it wished it could turn back. The housekeeper led Miss Marple to the entryway, her expression a blend of dread and recognition. A woman stood there, her coat neat but threadbare, her boots caked in city dust, her face unmistakably familiar, not identical, but echoing a face from the past like a ghost given flesh. The missing maid's sister, daughter, a survivor of the story thought silenced forever. Her eyes were storm-dark, alert and heavy with the kind of grief that carries a purpose. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Her presence alone shattered the illusion that the past had been buried. It hadn't. It had simply been watching. And now it was ready to reclaim what was taken. Ashmore Hall was no longer simply a house wrapped in ivy and history. It had become a mausoleum of secrets, each corridor echoing with whispers long buried beneath polished floors and inherited silence. Time moved differently here now, as though the very walls had begun to rot inward, pressing the weight of generations onto every breath taken within. The most recent death had not been an act of rage, nor the product of chance, but something far colder, more deliberate, like a signature carefully etched not in ink but in silver, the weapon gleaming with quiet intent beneath the chandelier's dim light. The antique cheese knife, embedded not carelessly but with unnerving precision between the ribs of the victim, seemed almost ceremonially placed, as though the killer hadn't merely struck but made a statement, using the family's own heirlooms as language. A language only the blood-bound could decipher. Miss Evelyn Crane, a woman who for years had played the role of the background observer, now stood over the body like a reluctant archivist of a legacy soaked in rot. Her expression was not of shock but of grim confirmation, the stillness in her eyes revealing that this murder was not a break in the pattern, but the continuation of a truth she had long sensed thrumming beneath the household's rituals. The pattern was undeniable now. First the silver bell chain, left coiled like a snake beneath the butler's body, then the scorched spoon found in the governess's lifeless hand, and now this, the cheese knife, a blade never meant to draw blood turned into a symbol of ancestral reckoning. All three items, once tokens of prestige and polished tradition, had been repurposed into instruments of guilt. The silver, once lovingly displayed in cabinets and polished weekly, now carried a new luster, one of judgment, accusation and unspoken sins. Whoever wielded them knew the stories behind them, knew the tarnish wasn't just chemical, it was emotional, generational. This was not a crime of chaos, nor passion, it was a message, carefully constructed, a series of murders designed not merely to kill, but to expose. When Evelyn summoned the entire household to the drawing room, she did not do so as a hostess, nor as a grieving relative, but as a witness ready to deliver the opening line of a long-awaited confession. She rang no bell, gave no instruction. Still they came. None dared refuse. Lady Mirabelle entered first, her face drained of its usual color, gloved hands clenched as if to hold back something threatening to spill, tears, or truths, no one could say. Colonel Bainbridge followed with his usual stiffness, pausing by the liquor cabinet, pouring a drink with mechanical precision but not raising it to his lips, the ice melting into a watery ghost of alcohol. Julian, restless, defiant, stood by the tall window, the storm outside casting broken shadows across his features, his reflection fractured into shards by the rivulets of rain running down the glass. The staff entered last, hovering silently at the edge of the room. Their presence, once easily dismissed, now felt charged, heavy. They had always known more than they were paid to admit, and perhaps now, they no longer feared being heard. Evelyn took her seat, not at the head of the room but at its heart, where she could face every pair of eyes, every flicker of guilt and fear and disbelief. She did not speak immediately. Instead she reached into the folds of her shawl, and placed a blackened slightly warped match holder onto the center table, a forgotten relic from a silver-themed ball hosted decades ago, when the chandeliers still sparkled, and the family's sins had not yet begun to surface. Its scorched rim still held the faint scent of smoke, like a breath from the past refusing to die. "This isn't madness," Evelyn finally said, her voice low, resonant. "And it isn't random. This is a message, a story that began long before tonight, and is only now unraveling." Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the stiff postures, the darting glances, the thinly veiled panic. "Someone has turned our legacy into a map, not a map with roads or paths, but one traced in silver and silence. And every piece used is a marker of something we tried to bury." A draft moved through the room, that no window had been opened. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did not warm, it only flickered, weakly, as if uncertain whether it still belonged in this space. Each item chosen wasn't just convenient, it was symbolic. The bell chain, rung in vain for help that never came. The spoon, scorched in the nursery fire we never spoke of. The knife, used not in service, but in silence. These are not tools. They are accusations, and they point to someone who knows what this house is truly built upon. No one moved. Even the air seemed to thicken, as if Ashmore itself had begun to listen. Silver had never just been silver here. It had always been memory. It had always been guilt. And now, finally, it had become a voice that would not be silenced again. The storm that battered the ancient walls of Ashgrave Manor that night wasn't just born of thunder clouds. It carried with it the weight of something far older, a suppressed truth clawing its way back to the surface after decades buried beneath polished silver and whispered lies. Within the heart of the manor, in the faded blue drawing room where time itself seemed reluctant to move forward, Miss Lillian Vale stood rigid, eyes locked on the glinting letter opener beside the cold hearth. Not merely a tool, but a symbol, a key, a curse. That object, like so many others scattered through the estate, bore no fingerprints yet whispered of blood, of betrayal, of vengeance long denied. It began with a fall, Adelaide's fall, a tumble down the staircase that cracked her spine and silenced her breath, written off as misfortune in a house that had perfected the art of looking away. But Adelaide had not died quietly. No, in those final trembling seconds, she had grasped at the only thing near, the silver letter opener, and carved not salvation, but revelation into its base. A name. A name the house refused to speak aloud. But Lillian found it, and in doing so, she awoke something deeper. She traced the pattern across the manor's history. The gardener found drowned with a silver belt buckle clutched in his hand. The governess poisoned after reporting a missing heirloom. The butler who vanished after discovering a second will scratched onto the back of a silver-framed photograph. It was not madness. It was a message, left behind by the dead for the living. Every item in the Harrow family's vaunted silver collection, once symbols of wealth and dignity, had become graveside confessions. Hidden doors creaked open to reveal forgotten journals, letters sealed in blood-red wax, and one photograph, torn, scorched but unmistakably damning, showing Uncle Peregrine alive years after the world mourned him, his face half obscured, but his ring, a distinct family heirloom made of blackened silver, impossible to deny. He had faked his death during the war, assumed a false identity, and returned to the estate not as a ghost, but as its quiet puppet master, manipulating generations through threats, secrets and silent killings cloaked in elegance. Miss Vale gathered the family in the ancestral hall, beneath the portrait of the first Harrow patriarch, whose eyes now seemed to glare in judgment. Lord Edwin clutched his cane with white knuckles, Rosalind wept behind lace gloves, and Thomas lingered near the shadowed corridor, his eyes calm, unreadable. "This house," Lillian said, her voice steady, "has not been cursed by silver, it has been speaking through it. Each artifact had held a piece of the truth, each death a consequence of learning too much. He's still here," she continued, her gaze cutting through the walls, "the architect of every tragedy since that war. And every time someone came close to unmasking him, they ended up buried in silence." The wind howled, and for a moment, it seemed the manor itself exhaled. Lillian reached into her coat and pulled out the true letter opener, the one that had vanished years ago, its edge still bearing the blood-rusted engraving of Adelaide's final message. "The truth doesn't stay buried forever," she whispered, "not even beneath silver." And as a floorboard creaked behind them, and the candle flames trembled in unison, she knew, this night would either end the bloodline's curse, or add her name to the long glimmering trail of silver-bound ghosts that haunted Ashgrave Manor. She had once loved him in secret, a forbidden attachment that defied the rigid etiquette of aristocracy. A man whispered about in servant quarters and dismissed by elders as dangerously unsuitable. A man who made her feel seen in a world where appearances were more sacred than truth. Lady Evelyn had been raised to suppress, not feel, to preserve the illusion, not chase desire. But on that fateful winter's evening, the illusion cracked. What unfolded was not premeditated murder, but an explosion of long-suppressed emotions, jealousy, fear, betrayal, all erupting in a single moment of fury at the top of the great staircase. A shouted accusation, a desperate plea, and then, an impulsive shove. The echo of her body hitting the marble below was not just a sound. It was the breaking of a legacy. She didn't die instantly, there were minutes of agony, consciousness flickering like candlelight in a storm. her blood blooming across the pristine white stone like a dark omen. And in those final harrowing moments, as her fingers trembled and her vision dimmed, she reached for anything, something that could tell the truth. She could no longer speak. Her hand closed around a silver brooch dislodged in the struggle, and with what little strength she had left, she scratched 2 letters into its underside, initials not of hate, but of betrayal. It was not a confession but a monument to a soul refusing to be erased. But when the others found her, Lady Evelyn's sister Clara among them, they were not ready to face the truth. Shock turned to calculation. Clara, frozen at the sight, made a choice that would cost her a lifetime of peace. She said nothing. The story was rewritten in hurried whispers: a tragic fall, a misstep in the dark, an unfortunate accident. The brooch vanished the next morning, quietly hidden away by Clara herself, locked in a velvet pouch and buried beneath floorboards of the unused nursery. She told herself it was for the family, for their survival. But guilt doesn't vanish, it seeps into the bones of old houses and the memories of those who walk their halls. For decades, the manor remained outwardly untouched: polished chandeliers, curated parties, a portrait of Lady Evelyn, smiling on the staircase where her life had ended. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. Clara never married, never left the house, never spoke of that night. And when the younger heir, the modern descendant raised on elegant lies and fractured bedtime stories, began to piece together the ghost of a truth too long buried, they didn't seek clarity, only control. They feared what the brooch might reveal, and what it could destroy: their name, their fortune, their very identity. And so they killed, not coldly, but desperately. The old groundskeeper, who once hinted at a secret hidden beneath the nursery. The housekeeper, who remembered more than she admitted. Both silenced not out of cruelty but panic. But what they never knew was that the real brooch had already been replaced years ago. Clara, tormented by sleepless nights and echoes of Evelyn's dying gaze, had swapped it with a replica before her death, hoping that by burying the original deeper, she could also bury the past. But guilt, like tarnished silver, always resurfaces. And when Miss Ashcroft, sharp-eyed and unrelenting, finally unearthed the truth, not just the artifact, but the entire web of choices, silence and sorrow, it was not just a revelation, but a reckoning. The initials were still there, faint but unmistakable, carved into the soft silver by a woman whose last breath refused to go unheard. And in that moment, every lie collapsed, not with fury, but with a long shuddering grief, the kind that comes only when generations realize they've been haunted not by a ghost, but by a truth they refused to see. As the sun dipped behind the gnarled trees surrounding Blackmore Estate, and a low mist slithered across the moors like a living memory, Miss Eloan Blythe stood silently in the threshold of the drawing-room, the weight of generations pressing down upon her like the ancient beams overhead. The estate, with its ivy-choked walls and windows glazed with time, felt less like a home and more like a vault for sins long entombed, and at the center of it all rested the Blackmore sapphire ring. Once a symbol of status, now a silent witness to ruin. For years it had been revered, showcased in a velvet-lined case as a testament to the family's grandeur, until a slant of dying light caught the underside, and revealed something far more disturbing. A frantic inscription etched into the metal, hurried and trembling, as if the very act of carving it had been a cry for help. From that moment nothing was as it seemed. Whispers began to seep from the walls, and memories long buried clawed their way back into the light. Eloan hadn't come merely to visit distant cousins. She had been summoned by an unspoken truth, one passed through glances at funerals and stifled conversations behind locked doors. There were rumors of a will rewritten in fear, of a maid who vanished one stormy night, of a child locked in an attic not for madness but for knowledge too dangerous. As she wandered the shadowed corridors of Blackmore, she sensed it not in words, but in the rhythm of avoidance, in the way no one sat in the old armchair, how everyone avoided the west wing after sundown, how the mirror in the hallway had been turned to face the wall. The fear here was inherited, generational, stitched into the fabric of every tapestry, every creaking floorboard. They had tried to preserve the legacy by sealing away its ugliest truths, but in doing so, they had created something more terrifying than the truth itself: silence weaponized. Behind a crumbling portrait, she discovered the loose panel, Inside, a rotting diary filled with smudged ink, desperate entries, and names crossed out in panic. The handwriting matched the one carved into the ring. Piece by piece, the puzzle twisted into place. Not just one death, but many, covered, repackaged as tragedy, when in truth, they were consequences. The guilty weren't monsters, but protectors. People who lied not out of evil, but out of fear of what the truth would do to the Blackmore name. Yet in protecting the name, they cursed it. The real cost wasn't paid in scandal, but in blood, in broken minds, in children who grew up sensing something was wrong but never knowing what. And now Aloan, standing at the gates with the journal in her coat and the ring cold in her palm, understood what few ever do: secrets do not sleep. They pulse beneath polished wood and whispered lullabies, and when finally uncovered, they do not scream. They sigh, slow and sorrowful, as if relieved to be known. In the end, it wasn't the ring that destroyed the Blackmores. It was the fear of what it revealed. So I ask you now, if you were handed a family heirloom, passed down with pride, but hiding a truth that could rewrite your bloodline's story, would you have the courage to open it? Or would you tuck it back in its box, letting the lie live a little longer? Let me know in the comments, what would you do if silence itself had teeth? And if this tale of velvet darkness and whispered guilt stirred something inside you, do subscribe for more stories where every echo is a clue, and every relic hides a reckoning. Share this with the quietly curious around you, for sometimes, all it takes is one pair of eyes looking too closely, and a whole legacy comes undone. Until next time, stay watchful, stay wondering, and keep your heirlooms close. You never know which one's been trying to tell you the truth all along.